Hi everybody, I'm Rudyard the Woodafaltist guy, and before you watch this video, I have to add a couple different preambles for all of our collective sanity. You'll see why. Firstly, there's lots of stuff in this video where, as I wrote it, I didn't know how, because human words cannot convey it. And the way I feel giving you this video is I'm trying to explain something that cannot be explained in words, which is intensely difficult. And so when I try to tell you something, I wish I could show it to you, but I have to write words. Certain parts of the story will make me, in the way it's narrated, look like a complete narcissistic egomaniac. I apologize for that. But again, it will make sense at the end. I, Rudyard William Lynch, was born on June 23rd, 2001, in Manchester by the Sea, Massachusetts, to my parents Mark Lynch and Leslie Payne Zimmer. Our current era of history completely discounts genealogy, which is one of the most deranged things you can do, since genealogy is the code which imprints who you are through your blood. Then once that's imprinted on your environment, the underlying code adapts to different situations. So when you can see someone's genealogy and ancestors, you see the previous actions their underlying code has done before. So let's go through my ancestors. My father's ancestry comes from almost all Ireland, apparently genetically from the south and the west of the country, which is the normal region for Irish Americans. They moved over after the potato famine in the early 1850s and around the time of the American Civil War. Some went to Quebec first, but then they ended up in the American Northeast, with my grandfather growing up in Jersey City and my grandmother in Boston. My father's line has a strange curse that each male must pick an impossible battle. My father told me growing up that the only thing that matters in life is honor, and if I lived with honor, then he said growing up that your status as a man is determined by do you hold your word and do you die on the hills you need to die on. And to be a Lynch, by definition, is to put your own honor above your life, which is the highest virtue a human can do. My great-grandpa was in the Jersey City police force, and he picked the wrong faction in the local Democrat Party politics. He was the last man to stand by his patron when everyone else had fled him. He killed his entire reputation and career in the city due to his loyalty to his patron. My grandpa, Joseph Lynch, grew up in Jersey City and worked as a longshoreman. He was 18 years old in 1942 when he was drafted to fight. He passed an IQ test with no background in mathematics and was sent as an aide to the British, he said, because they wanted to make Americans look better to the British by having a humanities-based guy who could talk about philosophy and stuff. And my grandpa always underplayed stuff. He might have been doing more stuff. I don't know. After the war, he went back to America and he was able to go to Harvard on the GI Bill. And he tried to be a lawyer after that, but then they forced him to take too many cases that were against his honor, and so he quit to become a professor. However, during his career as a lawyer, he befriended a Russian noblewoman who became quite fond of him, and so when she died, she left him her inheritance. And when he was a professor, he studied constitutional law, teaching at a school in northern New Jersey up by New York. And the book he wrote in constitutional law was that the founding fathers had purposely structured the Constitution so that there was a degree of plausible deniability inside the philosophic logic so that you could have a sub-variety of different possible positions with each law that was written. He married my grandmother, Irene O'Neill, where they met at the St. Patrick's Day dance. And she worked as she was a homemaker for the family, and he had 5 children where he moved to Princeton, New Jersey to support his family. He did a lot to try to assimilate out of the Irish community, so he studied classical literature, and he studied culture and the Renaissance, and he was really into medieval theology. And he became very Catholic due to the war, where he believed that the war was symbolic for the dangers of modernism and totalitarianism, and the only way we could break out of that was through a return to Christianity. So he was a very strong fundamentalist Catholic. And he thought the 1930s Catholic Church, which meant most people saw as ridiculous reactionary, he thought that it was too liberal and they had to return to medieval values. He was also, although he didn't teach at Princeton, he lived in Princeton, and so he was friends with a lot of the professors, and he was friends with multiple of the most important Catholic philosophers of that time period. And he supported my family off a middle class income. They lived in a small house together, and they had, I don't know if I said he had 5 kids before, but that's crazy. The Irish used to have that many kids. And oh yeah, so final hilarious story about my grandpa. So my grandpa died about 10 years ago, and he was like 95. It's crazy. He was born 1926. And for the final year he was at the home, or the retirement home, whenever he saw an actress on the TV, he yelled whore, because he said, quote, all of these actresses have sold their bodies to get their status. And he said, I won't stand for this. So next comes my dad, Mark Lynch, who was born in 1961, and he went to Harvard like my grandpa as a young man. He ran the Harvard Strategy Club as his hobby. After that, he started working in Wall Street when the Reagan presidency started, where he met my mom. My dad made solid money as a mutual fund manager and banking expert. He's an expert in regional and international banking. My father has the same obsessive nerd spirit as what I have, where he's read over 300 books on banking history. He may be the person in the world who's read the most banking history. I try to get him to write a history of banking, and he doesn't do it. And he runs a Mad Max fan account and banking advice page called Corpus Colossus on Twitter. Some of my friends followed my dad without even them realizing it. He also has a hobby in studying Marxist literature. And so growing up, he would explain Marxist lies to me, in that he would read these books to me, and then he would go through how the Marxists had lied, the methods they have used for deception, like overemphasizing numbers, not looking at practical application or human nature. So I heard that stuff growing up. And he said he studied leftist philosophy because he wanted to know how someone could have completely incorrect beliefs and yet be so sure of themselves. And my family were in the nice house and nice vacation cast of rich. I think my family's net worth when I was a kid was like $10 to $15 million total. And my dad, I'm sorry, I love you, Dad, but you have very strong Asperger's, which you might have picked up on. And my dad studies 19th century train routes as a hobby. He memorizes them. And when I was 16, my dad said, you are a man now. I had 2 roles as a father, to teach you to be a man and to teach you have honor. I have succeeded at both. You are now a man. You are now responsible for your own actions. Figure your own stuff out. Another example of the kind of guy my dad is that he ate tuna fish every single day of his life from ages 12 to ages 30. And he did it because it was 50 cents cheaper than the other sandwich option. And then it gave him crippling mercury poisoning. And my father had crippling mercury poisoning when he inseminated me, which nearly killed him. And nothing worked, and he worked with Russian alternative healers who lowered his mercury blood pressure. And then he went on a trip to China for business, and then jacked up the mercury again. When I was scared about failing a test in high school, my dad took me to the local creek outside our house, and he said, look at this creek flow, Rudyard. This creek was here long before the white man came, and it was probably here before the natives were there before, or before the earlier group of natives had replaced another group of natives. And he said, this creek will keep flowing whether or not you fail the test. You should know that so many of your worries are in your head, and you go out into nature and they're not there anymore. He told me that the way to get rich was to acquire useful skills, and then once you have enough useful skills, someone will pay you for a skill. And he said that there are certain hills you have to die on to be a man. And he said that when everything's said and done, the only thing that matters is that you stood where you needed to stand. He read to me and my sister before bed every single night for a decade. He read us all of Lord of the Rings, all of Narnia, some of Louis L'Amour, the autobiography of Lee Kuan Yew, Niall's Saga, and Dune, among like a dozen other books. He got me 20 of the great courses, or college-level courses, and played them in the car when I was a child so I could get an education with him. Then we would talk about those topics together. And my dad had a rule that I could only play strategy games until I was age 15. He said that he wanted to innately wire my neurology in a way so that I could think strategically on a basal level. He told me that this would do me more good in life than school would. At the company my dad worked at, he was one of the last people who ran a department that wasn't woke. The company was being stultified by bureaucracy, and when he retired, the company fell into a DEI bureaucracy that killed it. My father's become kind of a hermit, where he lives in the woods in Pennsylvania and avoids society because he thinks the public is stupid. And yeah, that's kind of his lifestyle. Like, I didn't really have any connections growing up because my dad lives as a hermit. And, he has a girlfriend, though, and he's a prepper. He has over a month of food and water at any given time in case stuff goes bad. I once asked my father, because he's Catholic, how does it feel to be a papist? And he replied, let me consult with the Pope before I answer. Now we get to my mom's side of the family. My mom was born in Kitchener-Waterloo, Ontario, to parents from Nebraska. This made her a Canadian citizen, which is an important plot point later. Her ancestry is mostly English, stemming from the third Albion seed migration the Quakers did from northwestern England to Pennsylvania and the Middle States. My grandfather grew up in one of the wealthiest families in Nebraska who ran an insurance company. He refused to take up the family business and instead decided to be a hippie as a young man. My mother is intensely resentful about this because she grew up in poverty, and so she left and met my grandmother at Unitarian Church because they were both rebelling against their Presbyterian parents in Lincoln, Nebraska. And they got married. My grandmother went to Swarthmore and then dropped out because she loved my grandfather to be a homemaker with him. My grandfather had a background in computer mathematics, but he lacked the personal ability to hold a job. So my mother, her brother, and my grandfather traveled around the world as he tried to hold a job. My mom partly grew up in Nebraska, Massachusetts, Iran, Maryland, North Carolina, Ontario, Alberta, amongst others. My grandmother is very left-wing. A funny story here is that when my mother told my grandmother that she was going to marry a Irish Catholic Republican, my grandmother said, who's very left-wing, she said, oh, are you sure he'll want to have children? They're not like us, They shouldn't have air conditioning in Texas for climate reasons. So she's very left-wing. And I once saw her reading a Afro-Indigenous history of America, and I joked, is there a biography for all 5 of them? Mother was valedictorian of her high school that she finished in Worcester, Massachusetts. And then she went to Columbia University where she got a political science degree. My mom has a wide variety of interests and is incredibly intelligent between anthropology, religion, philosophy, chemistry, political science, mythology, religion, I think I said those already, etc. And she was instrumental in establishing my worldview in as profound a way as my father. My mother told me growing up that the moral values of the society would get more constrictive, so much so to a level that you would be unable to breathe in a society filled with so many social rules. And they said, Rudyard, you either have the choice of working with this system or breaking out of it and doing your own thing, and you can only really pick the second choice. My mother was convinced that she was a psychic capable of communing with spirits. She would constantly tell me as a child what the different spirits were telling her. She said she spoke to God and the devil and Mother Nature, and she'd said that the native spirits were not happy that the whites did not honor them after we conquered them, and this is why our society is so obsessed with land conquest, because in normal society you would give the spirits an offering, but we haven't given them offerings. Politeness was incredibly important, and she kept on teaching me manners and class and politeness and self-respect because she said they'd end up becoming decisive to my life. And I was born in 2001. My parents were originally going to name me Noel, but when I was born, they said they could sense that I would grow up to be a writer. So they named me after the century-old poet Rudyard Kipling. They said that I just had too much energy to be named Noel because Noel's more of a bookish name. So for my sister as well, let me talk about her a little. She is a little bit younger than me, or was really creative when I was a kid. She was really into fantasy novels. She wrote multiple fantasy novels as her hobby. She knits for her hobby. She's made like dozens of sweaters, and she's really into Star Trek, and she loves her dog so much. But she's a Maoist. She thinks the government should forcibly deindustrialize the economy, and she followed a lot of my mom's advice, so she moved up to Canada when I was a teenager. She went to a leftist university in Canada. She went to University of Toronto, one of the best colleges in Canada, and she left it believing that we had to forcibly deindustrialize the economy, and she believes it's immoral to have children, and she believes it's immoral to pass on her own culture, and so she's going to adopt a black baby she's going to adopt a minority rather than having one of her own babies. And she's a lesbian now. As I said before, I was born in Manchester by the Sea, which is this weird beach town in northern Massachusetts up by New Hampshire. My mom forced me to be born with a midwife around 4 a.m. since she believed hospitals killed the spirit of a child through how they birthed children. And she also forced me to get no vaccines as a kid since she believed they were dangerous to spiritual development. I have very few memories of Massachusetts, and we were the only outsiders in that town that had moved in for decades, and thus the zoning board was able to kick us out of the town. They made up rumors my dad was making his money off drug trafficking, and my mom was a horse and dog lady, and they made it basically illegal to have both animals in town. We were completely socially outcasted and forced to leave. When I was 4, my dad made the decision to move our family to Philadelphia. My parents, I think, are pretty objectively part of America's ruling class, but they kind of degenerated into rednecks and refused to take it. The thing I thought about the most was the forest. It's just trees everywhere in every direction, and that always got to me, and I'd spend hours playing in the forest, and I was shocked that it went on forever, and it was so beautiful with all the animals and the grass and the creeks and stuff. That area of the country is super beautiful. It looks a lot like the Shire and this English rural ideal, but it's more wooded. And I just thought the world was an empty place growing up because we didn't even go to Philly that much. And so I just remember seeing infinite trees. Both of my parents nearly died before I turned 6. My dad was from mercury poisoning. We spoke about that before. And my mom was kicked in the head by a horse. And I just assumed my mom was dead for the next 2 days. And she was brain dead, and I still remember the air siren going off as the ambulance came to get my mom. My sister, Valentine, and I were hiding under the kitchen aisle when the policeman said, "Hey, kids." My mom, after she nearly died, said that she had visited God. She said that God had forced her to come back to help people. This resulted in her immediately divorcing my father. My mom wanted us to all sleep in the same bed as a family, and my dad refused. I ran out of the bed, and then my dad spanked me. My mom then took my sister and me out of school and took me away from my dad's custody. My parents put me in this French language school in Philadelphia for stupid reasons I still don't understand. I would count every single day until I was out of school, and I had a tic because I saw school as slavery, and I watched the Ben-Hur scene as a child, and I empathized with the galley slaves, where I felt like I was like them. After my mom took my sister, she took my sister and me. She claimed that my dad was an alcoholic who was beating her and my sister and me. There's literally no evidence for this at all. However, my mom is a literal schizophrenic that has different internal monologues which conflict with the other. She had no evidence at all for the claim and is mentally ill. She passed the Chester County test for not being mentally ill. And if my mom doesn't score mentally ill on a test, your test's broken. My mom really spiraled with getting kicked in the head by a horse. She had issues beforehand, and then it became magnified. And her entire life since that has been a downward spiral towards greater and greater madness as she loses touch with the world. Mom played the courts incredibly intelligently. It was basically an incentive structure thing where with the criticism, they were incentivized to accept the criticism because if there was any chance my dad was beating my mom and me, their career was over. So they sided with my mom out of their own basal self-interest. The court gave my mom full custody of me and my sister for years, and my dad was only able to see us a few hours in guided visitation. And my mom took 2/3 of my dad's money. I sided with my dad against my mom, and my sister sided with my mom, but it didn't matter. The court system sided with my mom. My mom said that God had told her the best way she could help human history was by torturing me. She said she did this since she loved me, and God told her that the more she tortured me, the more vastly disproportionate the impact on human history would be in a positive way. My mom abused me in ways I can't even put into words. I left my childhood feeling completely numb and just dead. My mom believed she would have an enormous breakthrough in the field of agriculture, in which modern agriculture was destroying the innate living biosphere, and she believed that by torturing me, she brought this fate closer. My mom started out as a sort of socialist and communist who believed that there was going to be a revolution against the rich. And then she went through a Wicca phase, a Christian fundamentalist phase, and by the time I graduated high school, she was a far-right borderline fascist. She wanted America to be a WASP ethno-state where she believed the Jews, the banks, and the Catholics were destroying America. My father did something quite heroic here. He realized that my mom was crazy, and he spent 6 years fighting my mom in court for custody of me. He realized that if he didn't do this, his children would just be lost forever. The sanity, safety, and stability my father provided me is the thing that kept me alive. I would 100% have killed myself if he wasn't there. And he was finally able to get 1/3 custody of me and my sister. The Chester County court system gave the nickname that the Lynch family were the people who would never surrender an inch on anything. I learned to shut up since the courts clearly didn't care about anything I was saying, and I knew what game they were playing, in that I knew they were trying to get evidence to support my mom because it was the easier choice. And I dealt with like about half a dozen different social workers in order to assess custody, and none of them knew what was happening. And for multiple of the social workers, I just realized the game and I refused to speak. There was a guy called D'Amico who was a social worker who I declared war on him, and I just stared at the clock for the entire hour session because he was trying to pull concessions out of me. I once told the judge, "Are you deaf?" Since past a certain point, I knew nothing I said mattered. I was an insanely aggressive kid. I literally would play strategy games for 4 hours a day. They became my entire life, and I'd play games like Age of Mythology, Age of Empires, Civilization, Total War, or Battle for Middle-earth, just to name a few. My mom had a rule that I could only play video games for 1 hour a day, but I broke that because my commute was 2 hours, so I played video games in those 2 hours, and my dad would subsidize and buy video games for me and let me play them as much as possible. And I think playing that many video games when I was in a traumatic experience was so good for me, in that it wired my brain in a lot of useful ways we'll see later in this video. I remember a moment when a teacher said, if as a class we spent 1 hour a week doing math practice in 3rd grade, we could get an ice cream party at the end of the year. I told her no, since that doesn't add up, because hundreds of hours of, or dozens of hours of effort does not equal an ice cream lunch. It's just not a correct calculation. And she kept bullying me to do this until she gave up and let me go to the ice cream party anyway. And every single day I was in that French language school, I would count the hours until the day end. I told my parents multiple times a week how much I hated that school, and they only took me out after 4 years to put me in public school, finally. I actually really enjoyed going to public school. Everyone was really nice to me, and I made a lot of friends. I even got along with the teachers, which I thought was impossible because I was so combative. When I was in 4th grade, one of the teachers saw a map I made, and she said, Rudyard, you're going to be famous when you grow up. Culture of the area I grew up in, Chester County at the time, was called God, Guns, and Horses. And over time, it became more left wing and it got pacified. And the way to see the Northeast is that in Pennsylvania is you got a series of different subcultures. So the way the greater Philly area goes is you have Midwestern Protestants, Catholic Northeasterners, and Black Southerners. And where I grew up felt like a cultural extension of the Midwest. It felt like it could be completely Ohio, where when I was in middle school, our curriculum in history is at how the American Revolution was amazing. Then all our history teachers were members of the NRA and they owned guns. Our Boy Scouts leaders were former Vietnam vets. It's very much that kind of culture. To change topic to something less pleasant, my mom started to spiral into bizarre conspiracy theories that my father had bands of thugs who were vandalizing her property. Chester County cycles through judges, and my mom accused each of the different judges and any social worker who stood against her of corruption charges. And the third judge built up a personal vendetta against my mom and demanded that every future case that involved her go through her. This judge saved me so much suffering, and I literally emailed her to thank her as an adult. My mom shot one of her horses to frame my father for killing it. My mom would also keep 5 cats from one of her friends in a tiny closet that barely had air. This is a weird tangent, but my mom was also obsessed with the FBI stalking her. I have suspicions my mom was involved in the secret government testing program MKUltra, given they sourced from places like Columbia Political Science Department at that very moment, as far as I've researched. Also know that she was molested. And I'm scared to even say stuff like this on this video, so she moved my sister and me against my father's consent to downtown Philly. This really disappointed me. I went to a Quaker school in Philly, and I was raised a Quaker because my mom has lots of Quaker ancestors, and my dad thought I should be raised Protestant. And Quakers are really big in that region of Pennsylvania because they founded it. And I attended 2 Quaker services a week for years straight. I've attended Quaker services for most of my life. And people have said to me that Quakerism has had an enormous impact on how I see the world. And that makes sense to me. My mom was a horse lady, and she also taught me how to ride. I was a pretty good horseman as a kid, and my mom said it's important because horseback riding teaches you leadership, because most leadership is implicit through body language and how you carry yourself, which is how horses communicate. And she said, quote, "Deal with a horse as you would deal with a woman or a crowd. They are emotional prey animals." The move to Philadelphia was one of the most instrumental turning points of my life. My father still lived out in the exurbs, and so I would commute between both. I moved from a completely car-dependent society to one that was one of the most walkable places in America. Philly has such a warm place in my heart, and it has a bad reputation for obvious reasons, given it's the poorest and most crime-filled of America's top 10 largest cities, but it has wonderful culture, architecture, it's affordable, historic, and walkable. I'm a walker by nature, and I would walk across downtown Philly from Camden to UPenn as a way to clear my head. Because for me, walking and thinking are the same process. And this was a really important period of my life, since around age 13, I gained self-awareness about who I was as a person, where beforehand it was like I was on autopilot more so. And I had several really important breakthroughs around the time of age 13. One was that I hadn't really ever read a book until I was age 12. And then I looked at a book my dad owned, and I realized, wait, if I'm physically capable of reading a single page of this book, that means, because it's a repeated task, I could read 1,000 pages easily. Because if I can read a single page, I can do the task on repeat since I know how to do it. And that was the Book of Swords by Fred Saberhagen. And I have, starting at age 14, read 70 to 80,000 pages a year and around 80 books a year. And I've maintained that consistently for over a decade. And There has nearly never been a day where I have not read in the last decade. I started this channel on my 13th birthday, where I stopped playing video games when I became a teenager, and I got into alternate history as my hobby. And I would spend a lot of time on alternate history forums, where I just didn't think they were that good, if I'm honest. The alternate history community is kind of amateur, because it's probably lots of people like me who are in a certain developmental stage of their lives. And so I thought I could make better alternate histories. I had nothing better to do. I hated school. And so I tried to make a alternate history wiki account, and that was too difficult with the account process they have. So I started making a alternate history YouTube channel, and I was really inspired by the book series Time Riders, which is a young adult sci-fi alternate history series. And Cody from Alternate History Hub was my biggest inspiration, and I wanted to make a channel like Alternate History Hub as a teenager. And for the first 7 years, I made alternate history content. You can scroll through the old channel. It's stuff like, what if the South won the Civil War? What if the dinosaurs never went extinct? And keep in mind, for the first 5 years of my channel, I had less than 500 subscribers total. I literally bought the microphone I used for the channel with money I made from the channel 5 years in. You can tell that because the mic quality sucked. It was a meme for commenters on my channel for the longest time. And I was obsessed with this. I would literally work on Christmas to avoid my family and just making content for the channel. And I read 40 books in alternate history when I was a teenager because I was bored and it was my thing. And I think people have commented upon alternate history's effect on my current philosophic views, because alternate history assesses the world in a probabilistic manner based on causation. And that's instrumental in my worldview. I think alternate history, my dad's background in banking analysis, and strategy video games are three really important influences in how I think, which look at basically causation and strategic decision making. When I moved from Chester County to Philly, I moved from a majority conservative area to a very left-wing area. I went from a society that seems pretty close to John Hughes or The Simpsons' stereotypical America from decades ago, which I just assumed was how America was. In Philly, our elite are WASPs, and so I assumed that that was the ruling class structure across America, and that America was still the way it was in the 20th century. And I was so shocked to see the World Economic Forum types, because I just didn't think they existed. It was a crazy wake-up call when I became an adult traveling around the country how backwards Philly is compared to other places. And I jumped from a 3 out of 10 wokeness to an 8 out of 10 wokeness. The small private Christian high school I went to had become what was by all accounts a leftist seminary. I hated that ideology ever since I first saw it. Teachers would openly say in class that there were too many white men in science and academia, and I was forced to go through what amounts to constant humiliation rituals in school as a white male. I read 1984 as a teenager and knew that the ideology I saw in school was the exact same ideology as that dominated 1984. I was a centrist until I was in college, but I started watching Sargon of Akkad, who was moving me rightward and who introduced me to conservatism. I vowed to fight back against an ideology that would push this. I just wanted revenge against the left, if I'm honest. Things got pretty bad in high school. The year after I graduated, they turned the entire humanities curriculum into leftist-based. This included race and science in the Roman Empire, as well as not talking about the French or Industrial Revolutions in the history curriculum or the World Wars, to spend more time talking about slavery. We had a mandatory social justice week to celebrate social justice causes, where my school flew in a speaker from New Mexico to say that using violence to push social justice was justified. It was basically impossible to not be a leftist. My school, for example, had a 3-year history award. I never won the history award, I suspect because I wasn't left-wing. I barely passed school in both middle school and the start of high school. I basically hacked the system by doing lighting and stage production for my school's plays. And then you have 2 to 3 hours of homework a night. That's like a Chinese work schedule. And I'm so deeply resentful of being forced to do this for my youth. I could have been doing fun stuff, but you forced me to do classes and you forced me to do work that had zero application for the rest of my life. And At the end of middle school, I couldn't see the whiteboard since my eyes were too poor. My mom refused to get me glasses for over a year since she said I didn't need them. And when my parents finally got me glasses, grades improved. I'm very resentful of this because I'm an innately nocturnal person. I go to sleep at 2 to 3 a.m. right now. And when I went to elementary school, the school was an hour away. And so my sister's school started earlier because she went to middle school when I went to elementary school. And so I would sit in the school parking lot for an hour playing video games until the school started. And I'm still very resentful about having to wake up early. There was zero reason you had to do this. And one of the things my high school did really well was it hired eccentric teachers, which let students be creative. When I was in high school, I made an independent study where I wrote a 250-page screenplay about the fall of Rome that followed 4 families around the Battle of Adrianople. I was in computer science class with a teacher who was a video game designer, and we had to make video games in computer science class. I told my teacher, who's a cool guy, he's made a great video game called Jamestown, about Martians space warfare 200 years from now based off 17th century England. I said I wanted to make a strategy game based off 17th century Poland, Lithuania. He told me I wasn't physically capable of doing that, and I took that as an insult to my honor, so I spent 4 hours for weeks. My religion teacher and I became quite close. My school had a theology program that was actually quite useful for me. I learned a lot of really important theology there, and they had a Mennonite teacher who, when he retired, was replaced by a black Muslim, former Black Panther. But he was an awesome dude. He went to Harvard, and he converted to both Islam and Christianity at different times. And he gave me a lot of spiritual guidance as a teenager. We would hang out for years after school, and he studied philosophy, and he was okay with me being a conservative. And he said that I was actually going to found a religion when I was in high school, and that was what I'd be good at. And I also ran a fight club in the basement of my high school where we'd whack each other with rubber weapons, and then we would basically bet on who would win with no money. It was a lot of fun. And most of the people from my high school are screwed, and I could see how desperate people were in the jobs market. So I basically made a rationalistic calculation that the only way I could succeed as an adult was by being an entrepreneur, because I couldn't develop in the system that had ruled society through the bureaucracy, because I knew the bureaucracy hated me, and I knew that I just assumed I was going to work a minimum wage job because I didn't know what else I was going to do. There were no opportunities around me. Like, I don't know what other people's lives are. Do people like, I don't even know what it looks like to have opportunity out of college. I don't fucking know, dude. Yeah, but I remember I couldn't sleep at night. I suffered insomnia in high school. I remember staring at the ceiling, thinking of various schemes so I could be an entrepreneur, because I knew there was a limited window before society fell apart where I had to become successful entrepreneur in that limited window. So I had crippling anxiety about how do I become a successful CEO before society falls apart. Because in high school, I sensed in my gut that the world order would collapse because I had stabbing pains in my gut when I was 16. And I had imagined the city of Philly getting shelled and destroyed. And so I sensed it on an energetic level, which is why I studied geopolitics. And I read 10 books on China when I was in high school because I thought the great threat to America would be China. So I studied China really deeply. So I'm going to just throw in some stories from high school that don't really fit together but are fun anyway. So my school had a gender studies class, which I took senior year. The teacher was pretty cool as well, where she was like this 30-year-old Irish-American lady, and her attitude was, I don't care what you say as long as you position it in a rationalistic argument. So the gender studies class was fun, where I learned all this leftist, social constructionist propaganda, but she was happy to have me argue the point back to the class, because she said me arguing against the point forced the class to get their arguments better. And so for my final essay for it, I wrote about why I thought we shouldn't have gender relativity, and she gave me a 99%. I got a 99% in my gender studies class. My best friend was a Chinese American guy from Shandong, and so what my school did was they took in out a third Chinese kids. My school was mostly gay and Chinese people, and Then they charged the Americans 80% less than the ticket fee, using the Chinese to subsidize them. But my Chinese friend and I, we would get drunk a lot, and he had a bunch of different sub businesses. He was from a wealthy family in China, and we kind of bonded over our innate entrepreneurial sense. He had a deal with Chinatown where I'd go hang out and I'd drink and I'd eat in Chinatown in Philly, which is a great place. And he would translate for Chinese businesses as his job. So he'd go to Chinatown and then he'd talk to the Chinese store owners and he'd do their American paperwork. And in exchange for that, there was a liquor store where they let us buy alcohol underaged for 1/3 the ticket price. And we would get, they didn't speak English, so Four Loko, which is what we drink, which I'd never drink that now. It tastes terrible. They'd call it Fourlock. So we would just get cans of Fourlock and then hang out at his apartment and just get plastered together. And that's what I did for senior year. And my Chinese friend and I, we stayed together for like a year after the channel got big. But he was kind of a dick and he was kind of disrespectful to me, which is, I've had like 3 or 4 Chinese friends and they all try to exploit you. That's what I consistently find. Chinese people are very short-sighted, or they're in their relationships, they're very exploitive, especially if they're from communist China, which stripped away their culture. And I wanted to study science initially. And what I found as a teenager looking into science is that science had basically become a new priest class where you can't learn it unless you're part of the university system that tells you the science. So I studied history instead because I could get a complete history education from my school's library and from buying $4 books at the bookstore. My school would have assemblies almost every single week. So we'd have church on Wednesday, and then we'd have assemblies on Tuesday. With the assemblies, I had a bet going with my friends 2 years in a row. First year, every single assembly that was about race, I get a quarter. Literally any other topic, my friend gets a quarter. I made money. Second year, trans identity and sexual identity. Every assembly on that topic, I would get a quarter. Anything else, my friend would get a quarter. I made money that year too. So they were just shoving this leftist propaganda at us all the time. And for those that don't know, Philly is almost a hereditary monarchy where there is a ruling the ruling family, or the electricians union, the Dohertys, they're Irish political bosses, and they control Philly's politics, and they determine who wins in the elections. One of my friends was campaigning for a candidate against the Dohertys, and it was just ridiculous because the Doherty candidate was going to win. And of the top 10 donors to the Democratic Party, the only union is the Electricians Union of Philadelphia and the top 10 donors. The only city is the city of Philadelphia. So the Dohertys control Philly. They have thugs beat up their opponents if they hold on to power, while Philly has gone into decline due to the socialist policies they push and deindustrialization. And the centralized government doesn't call them out because they are the top donors to the Democratic Party. But the guy I went to school with was really cool. He was a great guy, and he invited me to a lot of different events. He took a liking to me. And then he invited me to football games. Every single football game I was supposed to go, my dad had another thing that weekend, so I couldn't go. But it's weird that I was pretty close to, I just find it strange because my life has so many different timelines, and that was a timeline where I intersected against it, and then I didn't go there. And another moment is I went to a music concert I think it's the Jay-Z concert. It's on JFK Boulevard. They block out the area around the art museum. And I went there with some friends, and we were at a Nicki Minaj concert. I remember being in the front because my friends were more extroverted than me, so I went up to the front, and then it was Nicki Minaj music all the time. And I thought, this is literally hell, because Nicki Minaj was screaming, ass, 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 and I was being jostled by, like, white 13-year-old girls next to me, and I thought, I was having sensory overload, and I thought, this is legitimately hell. I just want to highlight this, where there was a moment after, it was senior year, it was April of senior year, and I had just finished all my college applications, and it was a Monday night, and I was partying with my Chinese friend, and I was drunk, and I was getting on a train from Jefferson Street Station to go out to my dad's house in the suburbs. I remember sitting at the train line. I remember looking out over the city, and Philadelphia was so stunningly beautiful. It was this beautiful line of lights stretching in every direction, and I could see all the old architecture. And Philly is such a beautiful city. Thank you so much, God, for giving us this world, because I will hold on to this moment forever, God, so thank you. Speaking of Chinese guys, there was another very interesting character who went to my high school. And I see him in some ways as a Chinese equivalent to me. He would constantly berate and insult people, and he would talk about how naive Americans were. At the same time, though, if he's my Chinese parallel, he's a sociopath. He was a legitimately bad person, and he was rude to everyone, and he was abrasive, and all my Chinese friends have tried to screw me over at some point. And secondarily, he had no interest in underlying depth, where he was just constantly learning stuff to look impressive, look impressive to basically get laid. But it was trying too hard and too direct. And so he would just learn different topics. He had 1,000 books, and he read little bits of them, but he was unable to gain knowledge. He just kept waffling around. He had difficulty keeping friends and that stuff because he was going through this peripheral, very direct experience of life. And I think there's something deeply archetypal about his story, where it's very high intelligence, very interest, but the lack of the actual motivation to do stuff and the sense of cynical, nihilistic disaffection from your environment. I nearly forgot to throw this in, but I was part of my school's quiz bowl team, and my school kind of drafted me into this. I didn't have that much interest in, and then the first time I went to quiz bowl, for one of the games, I was the best new player. So my class kind of drafted me into doing this, and I didn't like quiz bowl that much, but then the social pressure was there, and we performed nationally. We would go in a bunch of different we'd spend Saturday days doing quiz bowl. I really wish I didn't do quiz bowl, if I'm honest. The other guys on my team were assholes too, because they kept on trying to get me to study for quiz bowl. And because there's these packets you go through and you do them. And I said, I just learn information. I learn what I find useful. It happens to be good for quiz bowl. That's not my intention. I derive no positional advantage for studying for quiz bowl, which made the other guys in my team really resentful against me. I scored one of the top 10 best players in the country at one point, though. That was fun. Oh, no, sorry, best 10 players in the state. I apologize. Difference. My life has so many subplots that I forget subplots to the main story, and then I forget subplots which are part of those subplots in turn. So, when I was doing Quiz Bowl, I formed a cult around the god Crom. I did this because I was bored before a match, and I started praying to Crom so that we could crush our enemies, the other team. And then it worked. We kept praying to Crom. Kept praying to Prom, We kept praying to Crom, and we kept winning. And then I formed a religious cult in the Quiz Bowl team where I had like a hat, and we had an idol that we would worship. It was fun. And then we started losing a few games, and the coach of our team, the guy who had appointed himself leader of our Quiz Bowl team, he said we had to stop worshiping Crom because it wasn't increasing engagement. My mother was born in Canada and is a Canadian citizen. My family on my mom's side have been Americans since the Mayflower, and the reason she was born in Canada is because her parents were dodging the draft during the Vietnam War. And my mom saw getting me and my sister up to Canada as a way to get legal independence from my father, so she kept on forcing me to do it. And she kept on forcibly trying to get me and my sister to move to Canada multiple times as a legal way to control us. And my sister sided with all of this. She became basically a puppet for my mom. I remember my dad, my sister, and I were supposed to go on vacation to Austria, and then my sister just didn't come on the vacation. So my dad and I didn't go to Austria, and my sister just said she refused to see my dad. And this was a big court issue, and this really broke my dad's heart. My mom would get us to spend summers in Canada, and I hated them since she abused me so much. She was in a constant psychological psyop, where she would constantly say that I was going to move to Canada and I was going to live there, and the courts would side with her. She would just psyop me 12 hours a day. It was ridiculous. I got off on insulting her, and I would literally start fights with her on purpose to vent my hatred of her. My mom unironically tried to send me to Canadian military boarding school. I was suicidal when I was 14. My parents were forced to go into counseling by the Chester County court system. The counselors told me that I could tell them I was suicidal and that I could trust them because they were worried about my mental health and they wouldn't tell anyone else. They then told both of my parents and used it as a negotiating chip to force them to come to terms to end the counseling. And they betrayed me and lied to me. And My mom's reaction was that I was doing it for attention. I wasn't actually suicidal. And my dad's reaction was that, oh, Rudyard was suicidal in the past. It's fine now. I don't have to worry anymore. Every night, I would put myself to sleep thinking of ways to kill myself. I would relax by thinking of ways to kill myself. And I had a 5-step plan, starting out cutting my arm to feel like my life energy. Then I would jump off the Delaware Bridge, the bridge that spans New Jersey and Pennsylvania, to a icy death to die in the Delaware. That was how I wanted to go out. And I have an ability to feel the world in my body. This is how I run this channel. I can feel you. I can feel my audience. I can feel people I talk to. I can feel different societies in history. I can feel all of your emotions in my body. I have this ability. It's a curse, actually, because you have terrible emotions. You're all super depressed. Society's falling apart. But when I was a teenager, I realized that everyone was miserable and the current system wasn't working. I could feel on a psychic level that the system was breaking down around me, that the global order and everything I knew would fall apart. And I predicted the global order would collapse in the next few years. I thought it would be nuclear war at the time. And this is what got me into studying geopolitics. I would go into crime-ridden ghettos like Camden and North Philly to see if I would die. I would think about deindustrialization on a daily basis, and it's the most important part of my political formation. I never thought I'd amount to anything in high school, and I assumed I'd be working a minimum wage job. I knew something like Trump would happen. When I see deindustrialization, I saw a civilization in decline, and I assumed the West was dying, and I projected Pennsylvania onto the entire Western world, where I just thought the West was dying, and I would pray to God, very frequently, God, if you let me save my people, I will do literally anything for you. I know my people are dying, and if you can do anything where I can help them, I will serve you until my last dying breath. Yeah, so I would walk around Penn's Landing. I would look at the USS New Jersey. I'd look at the industrial decay, because this used to be the biggest shipbuilding, I think it was the biggest shipbuilding center in the world at some point. All of these old factories and shipbuilding centers, and I saw 2 ships pass. I walked at Penn's Landing nearly every single day. I was with my mom in Philly. 2 ships passed, biggest shipbuilding center in the world. It's fucking dying. Camden, New Jersey is apocalyptic. I'd walk across the river. I'd look at Camden. There's fucking barbed wire everywhere. And Camden used to be one of the wealthiest cities in the world. It's where Walt Whitman's from. Socialism's what killed Philly. Camden's like a city in South Africa. It's one of the most violent cities in America. And Philly is this tiny edge of civilization, because half of Philly is habitable for white people and the other half is just, you'll die if you go there. And going around Philly, the decay is so obvious. It's rotted out industrial buildings. Nothing new gets built in Philly. It's abject decline. And it's so obvious. This is where So I'd modulate my emotional state through assessing my emotions on any given day, and I'd have an emotional diary. And my emotional diary that I'd keep in high school was actually a big turning point for me, because every single day I would write down the inner emotions I felt and what I was thinking about. So I had a degree of third-person objectivity about my life, because I didn't trust anyone. I added up all the days, and at least half of the days in my life to 2/3, something really bad would happen. I took a test. I was so cut off from my own emotions. I took a test, do you have anxiety? And then the test told me you have crippling 9 out of 10 anxiety. My dad's new girlfriend would abuse me, and she would insult me at the dinner table. She told me when I was 15 that I was too immature to succeed. Almost every time we talked, she would insult me. My dad would side with her over me. Things got bad enough that I refused to ever speak to her. And once I threatened to burn down my dad's house for insulting his honor over Jennifer. I felt trapped, and I literally allied with my mom at one point against Jennifer to spend more time with my mom. And I hate Jennifer more than I hate my mom. My mom is so schizophrenic and evil that she kind of becomes a nuclear reactor of pure evil, and I can't really dislike her anymore. She committed to the bit hard. And Jennifer is just a resentful bureaucrat. I can't respect that at all. And one time, this is one of the most important days of my life. It was past midnight, and I couldn't sleep at my dad's house. I suffered insomnia in high school, so lots of days of school I walked in with only 4 hours of sleep. And constant exhaustion was how I remember high school. And my high school experience I remember closely as I would get home from school, and then I'd watch Todd in the Shadows content as I passed out in the hammock in my house. And back to the story. So It was past midnight, I couldn't sleep, and I was thinking of the first step of killing myself, which is cutting my arm. And I had a big kitchen knife in my dad's house. I put the knife up against my arm. I thought, wait, Rudyard, if you have a knife, and a big knife, why are you using it on yourself and not against the world? Because a knife is a knife. And then I realized the only thing that matters in life is honor. And that if I lived a terrible life, everything is outside of my control, I'm constantly screwed over. If I lived with honor, my life would be worth living. And that is the day I turned myself around and I decided not to kill myself. And I see this one day as the turning point of my life that allowed me to reach where I am now, because in so many timelines, I kill myself as a teenager. And I'm so grateful I didn't. And I lived life as if I was already dead for the rest of high school. Every single day I would tell myself, you already died, Rudyard. You're just playing the game further. And I became addicted to heavy metal. I would listen to heavy metal 5 hours a day. Sabaton, Flogging Molly, Nine Treasures. Because heavy metal would just power me off adrenaline because I was constantly exhausted. And looking back on my high school self, it's like I was permanently powered off meth. I was just deranged. And when I was 16, I cried for over an hour in my room alone at New Year's that Jennifer kept insulting me. I remember crying so loudly, and then I would realize no one ever cared how I felt about anything. I realized that no matter how much I was hurt, my dad wouldn't care or stop Jennifer. No one would ever care about my immense suffering at any point. The only thing that matters is that I'm useful to others and provide them services that they trade me for. I had another time when I was 16 when I had a concussion. My mom refused to acknowledge I had a concussion since she said if she did, people would say that she caused it by hitting me in the head. That I lost the ability to cry for over 6 years because I thought no one would ever care how much I suffered, so there's no point in crying. At this point, I made the decision I would either become a historic figure that would change the course of history, or I would die trying. There were no two other options. And there were 2 books that had a huge impact on me at this critical juncture. The first being the Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, and the second being Winston Churchill's autobiography. Your ancestors are here to help you. They wrote lots of really, really smart books that are smarter than anything you'll ever write. You should study your ancestors in their wisdom to be better. I was single-mindedly obsessed with my own honor and my intellectual studies. I realized I only had half of the emotions other kids around me had. I knew I wasn't a sociopath, but I was pretty worried I felt so few emotions. I would just walk around Philly feeling numb, and I wonder, why do I feel so numb and angry all the time? The only emotions I could identify with rage, stubbornness, and some sense of peace I never felt. I decided then that no one would ever understand me, and so I would try to do as much good as possible for the world in hiding, trying to change outcomes towards the better because people wouldn't understand me, so I'd have to work in the shadows. When I graduated high school and turned 18, I felt so liberated. I immediately started hiking the Appalachian Trail, which was what I always wanted to do after school ended. I didn't actually want to go to college, so I went on a gap year to forestall it. I had only ever camped twice before in my life before I hiked the Appalachian Trail, and I did it myself without anything else. The Appalachian Trail is super safe. It's way safer than America. I made it to southern Pennsylvania, and by that point, I was just tired of the trail, and my dad had to pick me up outside Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and I was sick for 3 weeks at his house. For some of the life lessons the Appalachian Trail taught me, one is that you don't actually know who you are until you've been in a dangerous, existential life situation. Secondly, on the Appalachian Trail, I learned that masculinity is performance. First of all, people were objectively very mean to me in my childhood, and I had every right to be resentful for that. And secondarily, that society and the constant alarms and the schedules and the morass of constant enumerating and constantly thinking is making us miserable. Because when I was out in the mountains, I felt happy. I went to China that summer as well, and this was a very formative trip for me because you can't convince me that country's not industrial Mordor. And I felt so sorry for the Chinese because I like Chinese civilization. I collect Chinese watercolor paintings as one of my hobbies. Chinese cuisine is one of my favorite cuisines. I've read thousands of pages on Chinese history. But then communism's done terrible things to it, and I couldn't get the help but get the worst vibes seeing China because all the trains ran on time. It was massive. You drive for hours with skyscrapers in every single direction. And it goes on longer than you could ever possibly imagine, the industrial scale of things. But I also knew this was a fundamentally evil society. There's cameras everywhere. I could sense the totalitarianism and the misery in the air. A soulless society based around greed. Going to China was a turning point in my life, and the air is completely polluted and disgusting. I was in Montpellier in the south of France for 3 months, and I loved being there. I went to a really good language school and picked up a lot of French in that time period. They use a really excellent teaching system where you have to have conversational understanding in order to learn the language. It fits with my empathy thesis later. I had to walk through a Maghrebi neighborhood every single day on my commute to the school, and I was pickpocketed there. I got into a fist fight, which I won. When I was in France, the Yellow Vest protest was in full swing, and they blocked off the downtown of Montpellier, periodically knocking out windows. I read the book The Great Wave about secular cycles, which is what convinced me to move from alternate history content to anthropology and geopolitics. My read on France is that it's a wonderful country. It's like looking at a painting. I'm so glad my ancestors left Europe. I would not want to live in Europe now because I'd just go completely crazy at the just lack of social mobility and lack of activity. They're so complacent over there, and they just hate excellence and greatness. In Peru for a month. I had planned to go there for 3 months, though. I was working with an Irish archaeologist there who ended up there in a crazy story. We would categorize Wari artifacts. We would joke about what to write in the classification for the porn art. I feel beyond mortified that I nearly forgot this, but this is such a good story. It was cool. So the virus, the famous global pandemic from 4 years ago, was hitting after I was in Peru for about a month. And I had a Chinese friend, the one who I did forelock with. He called me up, and he had some contacts back in China who worked at a hospital that said that this thing was really crazy and you had to take it seriously. So I got a flight out of Peru the next day. So yeah, I got out of Peru on the last call for the last flight. COVID was brutal. I think COVID was a real point of social trauma that we haven't actually healed from as a society. And I think especially for women, it's the period of just psychological collapse. I think I was just stuck at home with bored out of my mind and physically incapacitated. And I knew that this was an opportunity I'd never get again with a lot of free time. And so I started working on my channel full time. I worked really hard every single day of the week. And I remember it being really hard to maintain focus since I was in physical pain. But I worked because I needed something else to do to not go completely crazy. That summer of 2020 is when I made the shift to the anthropology, history, and geopolitics content that I make now. I met the man who would become my right-hand man, business manager, and best friend in March of 2020. Merrick Wright was a 21-year-old guy from Boston who was unemployed from a homeschooled working-class Yankee family. I told him he was a loser who should turn his life around, and I realized that he had incredible innate talent, and no one else had, because he's from a working-class background and never went to college. Now he works for me full-time, and I could never ask for a better friend and a better lieutenant. It's been a great ride, Merrick. I went to college for a semester as a freshman in Bates, a liberal arts school in Maine, an hour north of Portland, up in the woods. And the brief time I spent in college was kind of lame, if I'm honest, due to the enormous COVID regulations they had. The school was even more woke than my high school, and at that point, my channel really took off because I made a lot of successful geopolitics videos. And I voted for Trump in 2020 since I realized the left just wanted to destroy white men. And this was a big turning point in my life since it was when I decided to explicitly be a conservative. It's funny that being a conservative is such an important part of my identity now, and I started to really distrust the left. We're just posting completely demented stuff. Stuff where it was totally obvious to me that these people wanted suffering and the destruction of civilization. People would say you should donate furniture to butch lesbians, and dozens of people were saying that black people doing property vandalism was justified and taking the richest property was fine, which is just ridiculous. December of 2020 is probably the most important month of my life until I dropped this video. I got a check from Google for $12,000, which blew my mind, and I realized that was enough money that I basically had to drop out of school. The other thing is that a handsome young man named Matthew DeMarcantonio hit me up. He was a 26-year-old tech CEO who ran a company in the restaurant payment processing business from Teal Capital. That failed, and he is a right-wing, hyper-militaristic guy from a State Department family in Virginia. His dad is the former Undersecretary of Defense under Clinton. His dad's an awesome dude. I've spoken with him, one of the people I'd say the highest of. He was a big fan of my show and was part of a secret social club built by someone from Team 10, or Jake Paul's organization. It included NBA stars, Netflix actresses, billionaires, and a successful founder. And not a successful founder, many successful founders. I was super happy to join them, and the guys who were part of the organization loved me. I was widely known for once dressing up as a pimp on a call and making map-based sexual innuendos to a film producer. She was female, it wasn't gay. Sadly, it was one of the worst managed organizations I have ever seen in my life, and immediately shut down within a month of me joining. The founder, Max Beaumont, is a sociopath who I still hate in my mental book of grudges. Matt hit me up that winter and said he was going to Mexico with 20 of his tech CEO friends where they would rent out a bunch of villas on the beach. I said yes and dropped out of school to live in Mexico in Playa del Carmen. Playa is commercialized enough to feel safe, but it's also pretty Eurotrash if I'm honest. I was really rich at the time, and I was making $200K that year and $300K the year after that. I miss living in the third world. You can hire someone to clean your dishes and give you weekly massages. It's so nice. I came from an abusive, nerdy family and a Christian private high school. And so living with these frat bros in Mexico taught me a lot of social skills that I had missed out of. And I think a lot of you go through a degenerate college phase. I was rejected by a girl I liked, and so I went through a 3-month keto phase where I lost a lot of weight. I had gained weight during COVID. The girl turned around on me after 6 months, but then I had found a new girl by that time already. I went on a date with a different girl who used ayahuasca, which is an Amazonian psychedelic the native peoples use, which lets you commune with the spirit world. My childhood dream was to always talk to God. It was always the thing I most wanted to do in my life. Other kids fantasized about being firefighters or astronauts. I just wanted to listen to God all day. I wanted to talk to God as a kid since my parents had told me that all things stem from God, and if you don't know God, you don't know anything. My dad would say growing up that most of the social issues in our society are downstream from the death of God. I could tell even as a child that my people were dying, and no one knew how to fix it or that it was even an issue. My mind periodically whispers to me. It's something where I'll just be living my life, and a thought comes out of nowhere that I never considered before. I then spend years pondering it until it makes sense. A final reason I was really excited to take ayahuasca was that I had felt completely numb when I was partying in Mexico. I remember it was my birthday and I was at a water park. I just felt nothing. I remember even being in the water and feeling no emotion on the slide. I remember one time I was walking on a beach outside our villa, calling my dad, telling him I felt nothing. I just felt complete emptiness. It reminded me of college in France, times where I should have objectively been happy. I had no idea what it was, but I felt its absence. I loved her more than I could ever imagine, since she's what I thought I wanted as a checklist for a woman. She went to Harvard, she was beautiful, was anti-woke, really smart, and other stuff. We would get drunk walking around New York with a flask of vodka in our backpack. It didn't work out for a variety of reasons, and she was trying to manipulate me for social advancement. She once criticized me, calling our friend crying that I didn't convince her to stay overnight at our place, where she drove 2 hours to stay at my place at nighttime. And then I made a move on her and she said I wasn't interested. I said, okay. And then she left and then she called my friend crying saying, he didn't make me stay. Moving past her was really difficult and it was a big part of my development because it involved throwing away my concept for what I thought I wanted out of life. And I had this sort of romantic sense that I wanted a peaceful, stable, happy life. And I realized I didn't want that. That's lame. I have to stand alone as a man, and I need to stand alone before God. When I thought about how I loved her, I realized my brain wasn't really on my side because my evolutionary circuits weren't wired, where she was the kind of person I thought I wanted, but she was crazy. However, I realized I got off on arguing with her. I realized this was an issue I'd have to fix to live a happy romantic life. I knew something was off with my romantic senses that I had to fix. Ayahuasca is really no joke, guys. I'm so happy it exists. It's like touching the edge of the sun. Of course, as I've said dozens of times before, I do not support illegal things, and thus please only use ayahuasca in South American countries it's legal in. Also, please use an Amazonian shaman like I did. I was able to reach the spirit world, and I did it through purely ethical and responsible use of drugs. Hola, ¿cómo estás? I hope you can see that I'm wearing the Tree of Life t-shirt I have for this video. So, I don't even know where to begin explaining what I saw on ayahuasca. I saw so much of the spirit world, I could make a 2-hour video just from it. We were in a beautiful location with running water and a garden inside a cave with adobe huts built into the rock. Psychedelics hit me twice as hard as anyone I've ever met. Probably genetic reasons. Your trip will likely not be as crazy as mine. I spent something like 70 hours in the spirit world at least. I have 800 contacts in my phone, and I have spoken to God and the devil more than 90% of people in my phone. I have hours, and you and I have a photographic memory. I have hours of recorded discussion in my mind with multiple spiritual forces, whether God, the devil, Mother Nature, time, the anima, etc. So I have a relatively good knowledge of the spirit world, and they've explained me multi-hour philosophic discussions about the underlying nature of reality. I'm going to talk about things that I saw thematically rather than in order. It's all really a jumble. The spirit world is innately incredibly deceptive, and everything is everything and yet nothing, and that's just the paradoxical nature of reality. What I've heard is that if you have an incorrect theory of the world, 100% of reality is deceptive, and if you have a correct view of the world, reality is innately 20% deceptive. Unless you're wrong. You're often wrong, and always wrong in certain ways. The spirit world operates off technicalities, and it operates off hidden clauses, where the way psychedelics work neurologically is that your brain has certain subconscious wirings that you naturally form over the course of your life. Inside Out, the Pixar movie, covers this in a really great way. And the mind operates like a radio tower in which certain species, through a biological basis, or even different civilizations, wire the subconsciouses of people in a certain way on a biological level. And keep in mind how enormous reality is. It's infinitely large, and thus it's impossible to perceive everything. Thus we create certain filters for how we perceive reality. These are partly genetically wired and also cultural, which is why you could be genetically identical to someone from the Bronze Age, while they would see dryads and gods and spirits in the world and you would not, because the cultural expectations of your society wire how you perceive consciousness. Psychedelics have been in use for religious reasons for all of human history, in cultures ranging between the ancient Greek Eleusinian rituals, which inspired Plato or Pythagoras, ancient Hindu Soma, and we have very significant amounts of evidence the early Eucharist was a psychedelic. I saw many things between heaven and hell, so much so that I can't even begin to describe the totality of it. I have seen things I cannot even articulate to you, given they exist outside the human frame of consciousness, and yet are so clearly real. I have seen 1,000 years pass in a single instant, and the sheer enormity of the human experience as expressed in that time with each individual soul and each individual life. I have seen 1,000,000 suns crash together at once, creating such a level of cosmic destruction as to lead back to nothingness. I have seen the whole of human life concentrated into the great chain of being, and the whole of cosmic beyond human, all the animals and gods and spirits contained within the great chain of being, stretching and powered from the lower levels of pettiness and evil to God at the top. I have seen 1,000,000,000 lives at once, and in which you know the individuality of the living whole in the human spirit or the mind of God feeding off the individual lives, with all of someone's life clustered into a single vial that is their consciousness. I have spent more time than I would ever ask for or give to my worst enemy in hell. Hell is more horrible than you could possibly ever imagine. You don't even have words for the agony. The suffering is so truly great, it shatters your being, rupturing throughout your soul as you feel agony, and yet your body has already disintegrated, while your suffering encompasses the whole world at once. The suffering is so enormous it breaks space and time, so much so that unique moment is edged into history as being a time when pain could break the nature of man himself. As so many mystics have said before, hell is a place the mind crafts by its own design. God doesn't send us to hell. Almost by natural law, we guide ourselves down there if we deserve it. The afterlife is when your soul hits infinity right when you die, in that you jump out of time, and you are stuck with yourself forever. If your soul is stuck forever, it will lead towards good or evil, and that is the nature of your afterlife. You must firstly, when you die, see yourself for who you truly are. If you had to talk to yourself for 1,000,000 years, what would your interaction with having to deal with yourself be? There are 1,000,000 hells, whether that of psychological torture, physical pain, cold, or heat. Hell is yours. All of them share the feeling of being trapped. Hell is a mental loop you put yourself in that you cannot break out of. I suffered physical pain in hell you can't even imagine in your worst nightmares. The worst pain you could ever imagine is barely at all what hell could be. I had demons torturing me, ripping my flesh apart. My entire body was viscerally on fire in a way where every atom screamed with the most horror it could feel at once without dying in that instant. You have no concept of how much I have suffered and how long I have spent in hell. I spent something like over 80% of my time in ayahuasca in the spirit world in hell. It was truly a terrible experience in which my concept of time was stretched out. So I spent an infinity of time in hell. I think consciously there's still a part of me that's there stuck in infinity. And it was a truly terrible experience, but having done it, I have lived. There is no greater living than going to hell. This is so cool, guys. And having seen hell made me realize everything in my mortal life could not compare to the depth and the enormity of the divine. For the first time, life did not feel boring to me. I spent dozens of hours speaking to the devil. I don't even dislike him at this point. Much like my mother, he's so evil he kind of circles back around, where I realize he's just a wolf hunting sheep. He's a cold nuclear core which radiates suffering to others, which he himself does not feel, since at the eye of the storm everything is calm. The devil was quite civil with me and polite. He said that I didn't belong in hell, that under normal circumstances I wouldn't be there, and I had to pay a cosmic debt for my bloodline. After I paid the debt, I could go back and change my life. The agony of hell became the worst upon the deep realization that I never belonged to be there, that I had been cast into the worst suffering a man could feel for no justice of his own. I was stuck in this mental loop that was killing me. The mental loop was the idea that since consciousness programs reality, that because I perceive myself to be in hell, I would be stuck in hell forever, in all of eternity. I later realized this is the evil loop, or the closed circuit, which lacks humility or the evidence of the outside world, and allows the rationalizing of the greatest evils. The end point of Nazi Germany and communism is from the closed rationalistic loop. And this is the origin of atrocity and totalitarianism. This happened multiple times in a row, in multiple nights in a row. My entire body and sense of self shut down due to the horror of hell. I had to have my friends counsel me at the time to not kill myself. But back to ayahuasca, I felt the weight of history on my shoulders. I felt the choices I made would determine the lives of billions of people in the future. I felt in every inch of my body the desire to reject the responsibility. But then God said, I know you won't do that because you care about people and you know that this is your duty. God told me it was my duty to found a religion and that in the process of trying to not found a religion, I would do so anyway. He said that I never consented to this, but that my bloodline did for me. I told him I didn't want to, and he said, I don't care. He said that he knew I was a man and I would accept my responsibility. He said that my sense of honor was seen as a cosmic force to him in its own right. That this very moment I was living in would become historic. I also spoke to God when I was on ayahuasca. It's frankly hard to attend church anymore after seeing the God Christians claim to worship. I really don't know what to tell you, but I don't think the God a lot of you are worshiping is the one in the Bible. I hate to say it, but I suspect for some of you it might be the Lord of Lies, dressing in Yahweh's garb to tell you further lies. And the Bible does a pretty good job of describing Yahweh, especially the Old Testament. And he is like seeing a million suns crash together at once. Our mortal brains cannot comprehend his excellence and scale. He's more similar to a Lovecraftian monster, all things considered, than to the God mainline churches preach about. Yahweh's power is so enormous you would find it to be horrifying. He demands your loyalty with every fiber of your being. He is an irresistible force of gravity which sucks you in, for he is the only thing that has ever truly existed. I could see into the mind of God, and I saw it as divine clouds. It's the great mist of consciousness in which all things happen. The mind of God is all human experience lived at once, with each moment being a beautiful choice with a tapestry of such awesome beauty, you can't help but thank him for the extreme wonder and horror of it. The great chain of being may stretch down to hell, but by its very nature it leads fundamentally to heaven. Higher forms beat lower forms, thus meaning evolution guides us to be more like God. The sense of profound beauty I felt for the 5% of ayahuasca I spent in heaven was so enormous that it gave me the will to live through the hell. That 5% of beauty made the entire suffering of my life worth living. I knew that God was real and that I could reach him. God said that I would have to take responsibility for my future at some point. That it would feel terrifying, but at the same time, I would feel enormous peace after making the decision. He showed me that once I moved through my suffering, I would attain an inner peace, wisdom, and sense of direction that I would physically be incapable of believing at that stage of my life. He showed me the mental state I would have as a middle-aged and older man, and I felt such awe at my future development that it made all of my suffering worthwhile. He said that my decision-making and conscience would come to understand all 9 worlds of the Tree of Life, that I would gain a sort of connection to the anima mundi, or the experience of lived consciousness itself, so I could empathize with the human condition itself. He said this would be my great gift to humanity, showing us the whole tree of human experience, so that we could love each other for our differences. I saw hell below and realized it powered heaven and all the worlds between. When I looked down upon the suffering of hell and I asked God, how do you do it? He said, don't stare down too much, lest they drag you down there for no one's gain. I saw a million dreams of the future, and I'm unclear which are true and which are merely fantasies. You shouldn't take the spirit world that seriously. A lot of it's deception, and I think frequently of Lord of the Rings, where you look into the Palantir, and the Palantir is the bad guys, or Sauron's fantasy of the future. It's not the real future. And that's something to keep careful for all of this. And I'm an empiricist. I say this crap. You're here to disprove it. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. I'll change my ideas if they're incorrect. But I saw AIs grow so advanced it's impossible to distinguish from reality, and that we would upload our souls onto some kind of spiritual cloud. I saw that the government would move towards making 1984 a reality, and that men would be able to manipulate the minds of others to send them to hell. I saw that I would start to perceive consciousness differently. Finally, I saw I would live in a time where the dance of life would stop, where men and women would stop mating with each other for no fault of my own generation, but there would be extreme worry about our species going extinct. I saw that it was my duty to fight against this. I saw that my place was to be a man who stood for men, that this is what I had to do. I had a profound sense of sexual inadequacy, which I realized was completely undeserved. That made me realize I was forced to feel inadequate about being a man for no real good reason, that I had been tortured by purely evil and nihilistic people. I was talking to the shaman while I was tripping, and she said, "Rudyard, I see your destiny is to stand for men since the feminine has been kicking them around." I could feel the cosmic dance of the masculine and feminine break down. The dancers refused to show up for the match or even try. That this would be the great question of our time. That this would be the question under which our people lived or died. There's a few hilarious details I have to throw in here. The first is that the first form God came to me in is as a Zoomer bro, because he said that that was the form I best understood, and the way you interact with the spirit world is a two-way process, where when you perceive the spirit world, there's this divine semen, where semen can imprint on a variety of different women in different contexts to produce a different child. So you're interacting with the divine semen, where as you interact with each other, something new comes out, which is why these underlying archetypes manifest in different societies around the world in different garbs, because they're interacting with different environments. Where there's the underlying timeless semen. I'm going to keep saying it because I know it makes you uncomfortable. It's funny to watch you squirm. And so when I was talking to God, God said, "I can only explain the world to you." And he was doing this in Zoomer slang, by the way, like yo, bussin', no cap, cringe, whatever. God did not say those words, but that's the kind of vibe. And for example, your level of social understanding of information is the highest density that God can give you information for. And he said that the breakthrough I'm describing came out due to the computer revolution, which allowed a more advanced breakthrough in how humans process information, where the previous level was the book level, where the Abrahamic religions were established in the highest level of complexity of human data is the book. Or it's why societies around the world have beliefs in dragons but never existed, where the dragon is this archetype that manifests in a series of different subcultures. And when I met God, I first spoke to him, I said, "Give me proof to show that you are real." And he said, "I'm both real and I'm not real. I am a voice in your head, but I am also God. I am both." And he said, "I cannot give you information that you yourself do not search for." And he said, "Once you trust me, I will give you more information, but the lubricant of faith is the thing that allows me to transmit information to you. So until you trust me, I can't give you any information. So take the leap of faith and trust me." And then after that, God fed me all the information. I saw that we were about to enter a spiritual dimension called the Halls of Time, that I was the first man to stumble upon the Halls of Time, which are one of the most dangerous parts of a species or civilization's development. This was when we as a species have to grow apart from purely being ordered from God. We have to take responsibility for our own development, and it's the equivalent of a teenager or a young adult having to leave their parents to fully realize their place. This is a very dangerous level because your fundamental understanding of what reality is breaks down. You realize concepts you thought you could take completely for granted, like time or existence, are vastly more complex than we realize, and the real answers are harder to find than you could ever possibly imagine. And that this is a period where we have to stick together and hold each other accountable and make sure we won't go crazy, because the line between madness and sanity will grow very, very thin. And it's my responsibility to get my people through the halls of time. And the halls of time are also where souls come from before entering the body, and where many evil spirits live. That once we truly understand the nature of time, that everything would change. I could see that through all the chaos of time was my immortal soul, which lived in a cave by itself, pondering all things while helping those who needed it. I saw that my entire life was the unfolding of a destiny that I made choices in time to, but which all played out according to a plan. Free will and predestination are both the exact same in that God sees over time, in that time is an illusion of the passing of a single moment of decision, in which we truly live. I saw that through all the suffering, my life still did fundamentally make sense. I was at one with Mother Nature. I could feel the archetypal feminine force of nature, that which underlies all concepts of religion and philosophy. I imagined myself as a woman giving birth. I felt such horror and compassion at the female condition, their feelings of complete powerlessness with the world, how they're forced to shove a football-sized baby between their legs and not die, how their physical weakness was so pronounced they were dependent upon others for survival. I saw the feminine as driven fundamentally by fear and terror, and out of that is the chaos that allows new life. The feminine was its most dangerous when it's scared and has to be held back from raw chaotic collapse. The final part of my spiritual journey I saw would result in me allowing life to grow after me. I saw that what I just did would allow trees to grow and buildings to expand. I saw that life had won against death already. As long as that happens, I won, and I already won. Later on, as I researched these things, I found that an ancient Egyptian philosophy called Hermeticism had an almost identical similarity to what I saw of the spirit world. When I was on ayahuasca, my overwhelming first impression was that the Platonic archetypes and Carl Jung were completely accurate. I just saw the archetypes. Peterson was right to say a short answer. Ayahuasca basically fried my brain. I'm still shocked at how deranged I was. As I healed from the PTSD that came after ayahuasca, I always assumed that as I grew healthier, I would be harsher on how reckless I was as a decision. The opposite happened. I fucking love that I nearly killed myself to go to hell. What's the point of living if you're not going hard? As you'll see later in the story, I can be psychotically brave. I kept going back to hell since I could sense that it was my duty from God. When God tells you to do something, you do so immediately without hesitation. God demanded I suffer in hell 7 times for me to clear a generational curse. I have no other choice since my duty is to listen to God, and there's not an easier answer. I knew that he was the sun that determined whether I lived or died. I had stood before multiple gods. This shocked them. They couldn't believe a mortal had done this. And they said, "Mortal, how did you do this? Most of you did die by this point. You can't handle hell." And I said, "I know I'm Rudyard William Lynch. I know that I exist, and thus I know I cannot be destroyed by another spiritual force, and I know as a fundamental fact of existence that I exist. So you can't kill me." And so my guide to the spirit world was just refusing to die, and so I saw various cool stuff. I was a total vegetable after I finished ayahuasca. I slept for 48 hours straight after 2 nights with no sleep. I then missed my flight back to America. Merrick took care of me for 2 weeks in my vegetal state. For the time after ayahuasca, I felt as if the spirit and physical world had been so intermeshed as I could see one spilling into the other in active time. I could see the Platonic archetypes manifest in the physical world, while I saw the connection between all of things. And I saw that everything is fundamentally an extension of all things. So when you see one thing, you are seeing the fundamental nature of all things. I couldn't sleep one night, which was too horribly going to become my new normal for the next few years. At 2 a.m., I felt the divine will move through me, and I wrote a 10-page longhand in my notebook. I was in the hotel lobby for a few hours writing ideas straight, and the janitor walked up to me and said, "Hey, I can see that the will of God is moving through you, because when I write church music, I look like how you look now." And that longhand script I wrote later became the video for the manifesto of the New Right. Almost everything in that video is dictated to me by God. And that includes the ideas of consciousness evolution, our reality being a Darwinistic game in which God has certain rules which we follow to win, and on top of that, the greatest need of our time being decentralization. Watch the video if you're interested.